Eskom and NERSA are exploring ways in which to keep the price of electricity within the reach of the average South African. To discuss how they are planning to do this, I'm joined by Hugo Kruger, who's from the Truth and Energy Civil Engineering Institute. Hugo, good to have you on the program this afternoon. To start, can you explain why Eskom has even proposed these tariff changes and how they aim to make electricity pricing fairer and more transparent to consumers?
Nonchalant, thank you for having me. I think before I can answer that question, one has to give a historical context to your viewers, which is not communicated properly. South Africa in the late 1990s, 1980s, early 1990s took a decision to price electricity at the marginal cost of generation. In other words, you price it at the bare bone. Theory was if electricity is cheap, then it will be cheap to industrial uses. That would attract jobs and investment into South Africa, and you'll have economic growth. Okay. The problem with that was the electricity tariffs was kept far too low for far too long. And that is why you will often read in the media press statement that Eskom has had above inflation increases for 5 years or 8 years, etc. But you'll recall a few years ago, Andre de Ruyter made a statement that electricity is too cheap in South Africa and therefore we waste it. He was correct in my view. Maybe he should have said it in a different way. But the problem is when electricity is far too cheap for far too long, then you don't get adequate or what you call optimal economic growth for it. So in actual fact, you waste it. Now, this is not an insult to the poor. It should not be interpreted this way. The actual people who have benefited of cheap electricity tariffs for too long is industrial users, heavy industrial users. And they, therefore, didn't invest into energy savings techniques, into different ways of using it more optimally. And as a fact, as a consequence, South Africa has, in terms of GDP per energy usage, a ratio that is less than Brazil, for example, which is a comparable country to us. So the reality is electricity tariffs have to increase, but the way they have to increase is not, it requires a bit of nuance there as well, because with solar panels and wind generation coming onto the grid, the traditional way of selling electricity has to change. And electricity is now pivoting to be more comparable to cell phone tariffs. Now, with a cell phone, you all know you have a fixed price per month, and then you have a consumption, right? You have data or calls in consumption, and you have a fixed tariff. And the electricity in Eskom will be, as with time, structured that way, because generation, transmission, and distribution is decoupling, and only generation is really the consumption part. But now the problem is, depending on how much you consumed or how little you consumed, you can be either on the good or the bad side of this equation. And that's why NERSA has an obligation, in my view, to still protect the poorest households with these increases.
Hugo, one thing that's also interesting for me is this major change in the proposal is the removal of the IBT, or call it the inclining block tariff for residential customers. How will this change impact low usage households? And why is this considered an important step towards affordability?
The inclining block tariff, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest with you, what exactly they're proposing over here. But they, in the statement, they say Eskom is proposing to remove IBT so that users can pay the same price no matter how many times electricity is bought in a single month. Okay. So what I read from that, and they haven't given clarity as to what a breakdown is you will have a larger fixed tariff. Farmers, for example, call this a capacity charge. Okay, so if I understand correctly. And then, how much you pay per month in consumption will go down. But, I'm saying that under some correction because they haven't given details in the press statement as to how it's broken down.
So another layer, let's explore that. Eskom's proposal, it does include a charge. We mentioned solar PV customers earlier on. It mentions a charge for those using grid power as backup. How do you think this will affect the growing number of households and businesses adopting solar energy, for instance?
So businesses still benefit from adding solar despite this. They will still, but I suspect that in their pricing models, the solar panels might be a little bit less affordable than they thought. They might not pay themselves back in 8 years, but it might be 10 or 12 years, as an example. Okay, and the reason why this is necessary is when there's no wind and sun. There was last year or so, there was a big cloud coming over South Africa. And all the solar panels fell from 70%, from 100% to 70 to 30%, for example. What do you do during that period? You still draw power from Eskom. Now, what should the rate be at that period in time? You can't just pay the same tariff as everyone else. You have to pay the price of emergency fuel, which is the price of diesel. Or another way of doing it is to say, well, we're all going to pay for that insurance, because Eskom is now transitioning to our insurance. It's the battery's battery, if it makes sense. That's what they mentioned there as well. And how much is the price of backup paid by everyone and how that's distributed? And that is going to be that fixed charge. Now, this was already proposed to some extent by the city of Cape Town, and they had a bit of a voters' rebellion before the election. So the DA is one of the people who's the first to propose it and the first to oppose it as well. It's an interesting question for me is how's the politics going to play out?
That is quite interesting. But also another layer, Hugo, the proposal suggests significant tariff adjustments for large industries, for instance. This includes mining and commercial customers. Can you walk us through how these changes will impact these sectors and their energy costs, for instance?
Well, the energy cost, if they do business the same way, will obviously go up. And the theory is if you price them a bit more, I mean, you're not going to price them out of business. I mean, NERSA shouldn't be considering that. They will start investing into energy savings and technologies. They'll find ways to do more for less, for example. And then you get more economic growth per energy usage. That's the theory behind this. How it will work out in practice, I'm not sure. But industrial customers in South Africa are paying, in some cases, they've paid below China for a very long time, Chinese tariffs. And we just can't afford it, because in actual fact, what it comes down to is that the big mines and the big businesses are being subsidized by the poorest households. That's the way it was currently structured. So this adjustment has to come in. But I'm guessing they're going to oppose it. Now, the theory in the past was, as I said, but okay, we can just go into solar panels. We can escape Eskom. But now, because the tariff will be fixed, they can't jump ship anymore. They have to have a responsibility to pay back for the infrastructure that they're all benefiting of.
But NERSA and Eskom are also working to unbundle tariffs, which means separating charges for electricity capacity and network services as well. How will this help ensure fair cost recovery, but also avoid cross-subsidies between different customer groups?
So cross-subsidies should be on its own. It can't be part of that, for example. A subsidy in a sense that it's for the poor. Okay. So if you pay for a network, the transmission grid needs a certain amount of money, for example, per year to operate properly. And the charge that we pay for transmission should only be going to them. The charge where we pay for distribution, which in part is done by the municipalities, depending on where you live. Some people buy directly from Eskom. Would only go for that one. And one example of this is the Pretoria municipality, the Tshwane municipality, was basically in the red. Last year, the mayor, the previous mayor now, announced that they were selling electricity to Eskom at a loss, for example, because the distribution service was being cross-subsidized from other levies. Okay. So this is part of the restructuring, is that, this is actually one of the best things that the solar and wind industry did, is they exposed the inefficient pricing model of Eskom that there was. And now, because richer folks are going to solar panels, the full cost of the service has been passed on to the poorest households. And NERSA stepped in, basically. I mean, this proposal is not new, by the way. It was proposed a few years ago already. It's just adapted a little bit. And saying we have to reallocate that so that people actually pay for what they're using. And I want to say this to people who use a solar panel, because they're going to protest the most. If you have a solar panel, as long as you are what we call grid tied, as long as you draw electricity from Eskom, whether it's 1 day or 1 year, or 10 days of the year, or whether at night, it doesn't matter. You still have to pay the full service cost to the end user, unless you're fully 100% off grid. But if you try and do that calculation, you figure out very quickly it's too expensive because you don't have a battery big enough for everything. So as long as Eskom's your battery, you have to pay the insurance. And that is part of the distribution and transmission fees that we just talked about here.
Hugo, thank you so much for your time and your valuable insights on Eskom's proposed tariff changes. As the electricity sector undergoes these critical adjustments from what we've heard, it's quite clear that these changes aim to create a fairer and more transparent pricing structure for all customers of Eskom as well.